Welcome to today's Hinckley Forum. My name is Rory Stewart. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley Forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. Note that pizza will be served at the end of today's forum. Today's forum is titled Science Meets Diplomacy, a Utahn story of protecting the ozone layer. We want to thank the Utah Clean Energy and the Department of Atmospheric Sciences and the Wilkes Center for their partnership on this event. We are in for a great event, and it is my honor to welcome our guest. Dr. Stephen Anderson is a leading environmental scientist and economist and was a main architect of the landmark Montreal Protocol, one of the most successful and impactful environmental treaties in history. In the 1987 Montreal Protocol phased out use of 95% of the world's ozone depleting substances, mainly chlorofluorocarbons, which were on track to destroy 2/3 of the stratospheric ozone layer by 2065, threatening crop yield and human health across the globe. Dr. Anderson played a key role in bridging the gap between science and diplomacy, collaborating with the Reagan administration to forge the international agreement. Anderson was born and raised in Logan, Utah, and studied business administration at Utah State University. In 2013, he became president and executive director for the Center for Sustainable Energy, a 501c3 dedicated to accelerating transition to a sustainable world powered by clean energy. He was a co-founder of the Plastic Oceans Project, which educated youth on ocean health. In 2019, he became president of I Love a Clean San Diego, a 501c3 that worked to educate the public on sustainability, prevent waste, and clean the environment.
Actually, not me. We drifted off topic here somehow.
Oh.
The first part's true. So, not San Diego. Yes, Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development. And I would have loved to have done these things. Who knows what robot took over the bio? So maybe we'll just move ahead.
Yeah, no, that's totally fine. After we hear from Dr. Anderson, we'll be joined by Jessica Haskins from the University of Utah's Department of Atmospheric Sciences, and we move to a Q&A portion of today's event. So please join me in welcoming our guests.
Thank you for the flattering invitation, even if only partly true. It's great to be here. And in thinking over what I could say here, of course, I have a story to tell. And then I'm very interested in giving my best advice on how you can be instrumental in changing some part of the world in a positive way. When I took a look at the Hinckley Center, what impressed me the most was that it's a place where politics is respected and honorable and considered essential to process. And of course, that's all true, although not known as true much across the United States right now. So that gives you a challenge to restore yourselves to your rightful position as center for bringing forward an issue and solving it. So what better place to be right now to do these things? It's also true that if you look carefully at what politics does, is it respects individuals, because those are people representative, but also cultures. And that it's an added challenge right now to bring back that kind of respect and dignity in civil discourse, and it makes your jobs harder. And I know that most of you aren't planning to be politicians yourselves, that you'll be influential one way or the other, and you know that many people that start out with an ambition to support politics end up being elected themselves. So you should have every ambition to go as far as you can go. So in order to do that, you want to polish your ambition to be ready for a fast start, and then you want to be agile as you go forward. The story I'm going to tell is exactly what's in the title, the idea of bringing science to diplomacy and to success. And I think the success is what I would emphasize the most. It was never the case that the people worked on the Montreal Protocol had anything in mind except total success. And so it was a driving ambition. It was more like a political campaign than a typical diplomatic campaign. If you look at all the treaties across the United States, or across the United Nations, the Montreal Protocol is one of the only treaties that accomplished its objectives. And I think that's because it had ambition internally and it was organized to win. So I'll describe some of that to you in detail. One of the things I do, my role in the Montreal Protocol was that I was an early researcher in 1974 studying the effect of supersonic transport on the stratospheric ozone layer and climate. And when I made that study, I found that it would be devastating to agriculture. And it changed my ambitions. I had wanted to be a college professor, and I decided to be an environmental activist instead. That you should not merely study something, you should change something. So I became an applied economist. I also joined the US EPA a year before the Montreal Protocol and helped design it, and then stayed with the Montreal Protocol as the founding chair of the Technology and Economic Assessment Panel for 20 years. So we were the people that guided people to technology, but we took it more seriously. We got involved in developing, inventing, promoting, and then penetrating markets. So again, very activist. And I became the historian of the Montreal Protocol because I'm a very hardworking person. And I figured that if anyone was going to tell the story correctly, it would have to be an insider. So I published a number of books over many years. The last one had 40 co-authors from 26 countries. So it's an authentic history, people telling their own story, available for $3 on Amazon. Unbelievable. So you've seen a million diagrams like this. The atmosphere is complicated, it's fragile. These are the effects of chemical emissions, of ozone depleting substances. And I'll describe to you a little bit about why the ozone layer is so important. So the ozone layer is a thin layer of gas in the stratosphere that shields the Earth against harmful ultraviolet radiation. Ultraviolet radiation causes skin cancer and cataracts. It suppresses the human immune system. It damages agricultural crops and ecosystems. It diminishes the carbon sink and many other effects, including deteriorating the built environment. As everyone in Utah would know, paint lasts a short period of time. Even statues deteriorate. And it's a huge expense to have ultraviolet destroy fabrics and coatings and furniture and all the rest. So there's a huge impact. But primarily the concern was the health impact: skin cancer, cataracts, suppression of the immune system. So when the Nobel Prize was awarded to Crutzen, Rowland, and Molina in 1995, the designation there describes it almost unbelievably, but accurately. This is a pretty serious effect to destroy life on Earth. So the Montreal Protocol took on the obligation to protect the ozone layer against these chemicals and restore it to its shielding feature to protect life. And then the next quote from Dr. Paul Newman, who's co-chair of the science assessment for the Montreal Protocol, with a number of scientists got together and said, what would have happened if they had not discovered the Antarctic ozone layer and not reacted quickly, and the Montreal Protocol had not been signed and strengthened and implemented? And the answer is it would become unlivable outside 2065. And you can see here, 5 minutes skin burn, and then you have to be back inside. So it would be a terrible society, almost unlivable, and scientists called it a horrible place. So it was every motivation for all the people that understood what the risks were. Kind of a terrible job to have, actually. So the reason we got to this dilemma is that in 1928, Thomas Midgley invented something called a chlorofluorocarbon, CFC. And the honorable intention was to replace toxic and flammable refrigerants. And the new chemical had every desirable feature: colorless, odorless, non-toxic, non-flammable, energy efficient, very inexpensive. And no one knew about ozone depletion and climate change. So it was a big celebration. It was called a miracle chemical. It proliferated lots of things, so it became a chemical that used the chlorofluorocarbons and bromofluorocarbons are used for all kinds of applications like foam and solvents and medical device cleaning and aerosol medicines such as metered-dose inhalers for asthma and COPD. It was used for fire extinguishing and a pesticide. So 240 sectors in 1987 were using these chemicals. And in 1974, years earlier, let's go back one more year, it's 1973, it was discovered that in every air sample taken everywhere in the world, they found CFC. So 1972, 73 is the expedition. They published the paper, and Sherry Rowland and Mario Molina look at it and say, I wonder what happens to those CFCs. Where do they go? What happens to them? And in 74, they published a warning that they destroy the ozone layer and they would cause skin cancer. And by the end of the year, they were calling for a boycott of cosmetic convenience and household aerosol products like pesticides. So it was an activist science that got going. 85, the Antarctic ozone hole was discovered. 87, the Montreal Protocol is signed. And in 1988, just 1 year after signing, there was a huge international scientific study. And upon reading the study, DuPont declared they were going to make an orderly exit from the business, which forced other chemical companies to declare the same. So the industry itself declared itself unsustainable and then moved into a pattern of getting out of the business. So there was every incentive. No one had a choice. The Montreal Protocol was signed. It's a binding treaty. It's not a treaty of goals. It's a treaty of commitments. It has trade penalties, and it has finance mechanisms and like very powerful, and something any political science designer of a treaty or a law would be very proud of. You know what you want to do, you know how to do it, you put all the pieces into action. So it's a case of congratulations and hope for the future. So if you look at the situation today, every country in the world is a party to the Montreal Protocol. This is the first treaty that ever achieved universal ratification. Hundreds of United States nations treaties on mundane topics like radio frequency for airplanes. You would think everyone would have signed that. Not true. This was the only treaty that got universal ratification, and it stayed the only treaty for many years. Now the IPCC has caught up because they're very competitive. We don't let people lag behind for far, but there's not other treaties that have achieved this. None of the peace treaties, none of the nuclear proliferation treaties, none of the health treaties, telecommunications. So this is a big achievement for the United Nations. And many of the people that have been the Secretary General of the United Nations have declared the Montreal Protocol as the biggest success. So 99% today of all the chemicals that were controlled by the Montreal Protocol are phased out of production and consumption. All the evidence is there that the chlorine and bromine is reducing in the atmosphere. The ozone layer is recovering. It's on the path to recovery by mid-century. So they've accomplished their objective. These chemicals have a life in the atmosphere of 100 years or more. And so after you stop production, it takes a while for them to wash out. That's why the recovery doesn't come quickly. It's one of the reasons it was important to get an early start and then keep strengthening it till you've done everything imaginable, and there are a few more things could be done. So it turns out also that the Montreal Protocol science, from the science panel that puts an assessment together every 4 years, is absolutely accurate business advice. It's a crystal ball of the future. That they have never made a mistake on the impacts of these chemical substances. And so any company that was deciding what chemicals shall we choose, either as new chemicals or to replace the ozone depleting, will be safe in the atmosphere and sustainable. So it has this huge business advantage that I think people forget, the advantage of science to business and the advantage of science to things like state governments that are putting up budgets for infrastructure and so forth, and better worry about the risk of climate change and the like that could invalidate the infrastructure and require its premature replacement at huge cost that nobody would want, right at the time where people are suffering their own private losses and the like. One of the things you could think about as political scientists is up till now people have presumed that you could self-insure a state. It's so large, nothing could possibly happen in more than one or two places. So why would you buy insurance? You can spread your own risk and you can charge taxpayers an even charge and take care of the problem. No longer true. Insurance companies are walking off with insurance and the state governments are getting stuck with FEMA obligations that are not financed. And then pretty soon people will worry about the jobs and all the rest of this stuff. So the political challenges are terrific. So the other thing that's interesting is a woman named Jean Oldwang, who lives in Park City, has written a book you should look up on Amazon, and it made a case study of the Montreal Protocol, and it showed that one of the reasons it succeeded was the deep connections of these people like me that got started early and stayed in the game the whole time. And what she found was that the bonding of the community and the trust and the reliability helped the Montreal Protocol succeed. That you didn't have to persuade a new cast of characters every year, that there was a carryover from the last year, just like there is in politics historically, where you wouldn't be starting out with new politics every year on a new topic. You'd be picking up legacy achievements and then you'd be building those, amplified, doubling them up and so forth. So it's also true, as I was about to come out here, I was thinking, well, this is interesting. Steve comes back to Utah after, decades away. What are the things that were done in Utah to protect the ozone layer? So I twicked my memory and I looked through my books and so forth, and several things stands out. First of all, the Huntsman Corporation in the earliest days was part of a voluntary partnership that I started to phase out the use of CFC in food packaging, like the McDonald's clamshell. And that agreement was an agreement that within 1 year, every company would halt the use of CFC-12, and they could use a less damaging chemical, HCFC-22, for up to a year, and then they had to change to something that was ozone safe. And so that transition was so fast and so effective and so satisfying to everyone in the United States that the American manufacturers published a handbook of the technology, including the details of the assembly line and so forth, chemical mixing, and distributed it worldwide. And then within 2 or 3 years, everyone had stopped the use of that product everywhere. So it was a heroic effort, showed teamwork, showed the idea of organizing, the advantage of asking for something you need and then getting it, and then reinforcing it and the like. What we called it at the time, it was a project we called leapfrogging shame, because these companies had been shamed by children and by environmental activists for what they were doing. Friends of the Earth had a program called Styro Wars, because why would a child want to go to a food establishment, McDonald's, and buy a hamburger that's wrapped in a foam that destroys the future? McDonald's was smart enough to do a poll, and they found out it wasn't just the activist children. All the children were worried about the future. And they realized that it's the children that tell their parents where they're going for lunch on Sunday, that the customer was the child, it was not the parents. So McDonald's, while we were doing our voluntary partnership, was banning their use in their franchises of this products. So we were building up intentionally and through intervention, just like a political campaign would, getting everybody on board so that there's no question in anyone's mind, and someone that otherwise might say, why don't we wait, would say there's no way to wait, we want to stay in business. So it's lighthearted, it's reinforcing, it's character building, it's reputation keeping, but it's also fierce, just like lots of politics, right? You know that. Thiokol, of course, is a company that built the rocket for the space shuttle. And they have lots of uses of ozone depleting substances. It turned out hundreds, because it's used as a plasticizer and a solvent. It's used as a diluent in the rocket fuel. It's got lots of uses. So they came on board early because of NASA, their big customer, is Mission to Planet Earth. NASA's people that were helping identify the ozone layer problem. How embarrassing can it be for a federal agency to be destroying the ozone layer by the rockets to take the satellites to space that observe ozone depletion and craft the answers to solve it, right? So top down, bottom up, and they were the best engineers in the world for the things they were doing. So the Utah engineers were able to find the solutions, pare them down to the best solution, describe them in detail, and save a number of other companies having to do any research at all. And all they had to do is take the handbooks from Thiokol and say, what uses do we have that are on the chart? What did they choose? Let's do that. So it avoids the duplication of effort. It speeds the research. You don't have any train wrecks because they try it and it doesn't work, and everybody's satisfied. And the people that develop the alternatives along the way profit immensely because they're satisfying their customers for a criteria that customers didn't even know about, ozone safe. So the political opportunity is interesting, and there are plenty of places to study the Montreal Protocol and how it was done, and how diplomacy, the politics, both local, state, national, federal, international, played into this, because every country today has environmental non-governmental organizations. Every country has multinational NGOs, like professional societies and standards organizations, all that stuff. And many countries have agreements, either trade agreements or research agreements or science agreements or educational exchange agreements. It's a very, very interesting political system. And it's rarely considered as that outside the Montreal Protocol. I think the protocol was smart to respect politics, that you can't get things done unless you organize and orchestrate. That what good would it be to have a campaign if you just announced you were running and then made a copy of your ideas and put it on the web? That would be pretty incomplete, right? It would be pretty incomplete to find out the ozone layer was being depleted and then cast it out for someone to find a solution with nobody driving the dialogue, nobody putting forward the vote, nobody getting the vote, twisting the arms, and then making sure everybody did what they signed on to do. So this is, I think, heart and soul of political science. So it's also the case that this is really an excellent idea, this environmentalism, for satisfying humans. Because I just made a short list. Food security, pretty important. The ozone layer protects food and agriculture and marine systems. For every 1% depletion in ozone layer, 1% destruction of agricultural crops. So you heard in the introduction that with nothing done, if no discovery of the ozone hole, no warning by Molina and Rowland, 2/3 of the ozone would be gone. 2/3 of agricultural production in the world, end of game, from starvation alone. So that's pretty serious. So if you're a politician and you can deliver that kind of benefit, that's a very good deal. The human and the ecosystem health, the cancer avoided, imagine if immune systems were more threatened than they are today. It's already a very serious challenge, right? So you're hanging on to the things that give satisfaction and quality of life and prosperity, that you're keeping that. And it's a harder argument to make than something that brings more of that stuff, but protecting what you've got, not killing the golden goose. This is a pretty good idea too. And then of course, There's the fact that it's sustainable business and market access. And even as I speak, there are companies that are poised to profit for the next step of the Montreal Protocol. And they still have the support of all these technical and scientific committees and all of these diplomats that have been satisfied with what's been accomplished and want to do the next step. That I don't know of any significant group that's opposed to the Montreal Protocol as insiders. Plenty of people outside. So you make a positive difference to yourself and the society. What better than working on something important over the period of your life? And then one of the things I'm famous for is I like celebration and I like awards. And so I've invented at US EPA international awards for climate and ozone, and we presented hundreds of them over a 20-year period of time. And it caused adoration beyond people's imagination. Highly respected. Families would fly in from everywhere. Companies would hold a follow-up celebration for the company for what they have achieved. It would be placed in the stockholder reports and the annual meeting reports. There'd be in the lobbies if you walked in, like when you walk into Hinckley Center, you'd see that you'd accomplished a lot of stuff over the years, and some of it was you protected the ozone layer. Many, many cases, I know this is hard to believe, someone would come to the awards with their family, and it would be the first time that the spouse and the children had any idea what they did, why was it important, and that a huge audience would clap. This is priceless. This is exactly what a politician wants every day, right? Everyone else knows that adoration and respect and reinforcement and reward is important. Oddly enough, until we offered these at the US EPA, there were no awards for international leadership and champions. We called them champions. We also started them at the United Nations, the first awards the United Nations give. So everybody was glad to have victory, but not everybody was able to acknowledge it or to pick out the few people that were extraordinary. Because of course, an award is a controversial thing. Anything that's worthwhile doing will have people that are not all that happy with what you're doing. So, and then avoiding blame and shame and retribution and regret and revenge. This is hugely important. Imagine companies that cause your family to get skin cancer and people die. And then you know that they've done it, they knew what they were doing, and you can't imagine the pain. So we avoided all that. These companies got to walk off what they had done over the many years in the past. They got to become champions by moving quickly to a new technology, and they avoided all of these things that they couldn't have imagined how painful it would be. But this is really interesting because it's value added, it's inconspicuous, but it's of immense value. And if you're in that business of being the support for what's being done, you can be proud of yourself for doing that. It's fantastic. So then I said to myself, coming back to Utah, I'm going to talk to some super ambitious people that want to make a difference in the world. What would be your advice? What are the things? And this is really true. I think a lot of the values I gained as a kid in Utah turned out to be important. I don't know Utah much today. I have a sister who lives here. I talked to her and quizzed her and interrogated her. And I got some idea of what Utah is like today, but not much. But when I was a kid in Utah, education was incredibly important and respected, and there was no one respected in my town more than the teachers. And it was also the case that there was a huge push for honesty and integrity and for trustworthiness. And I think that's very useful. I think those are sustained values, and I think the people that think they can suspend trust for a little while or take a time out from integrity, I think they're wrong. I think that follows through their life. There was nobody with the tools to follow me through my life when I was a professional working at the EPA. Today, they'll know everything. They'll know everything about you. The dossier will be complete. So you better make sure that you operate your life from junior high school onward, in a pretty sincere way to maintain all of those qualities so that there's nothing that can tarnish you. What a good challenge. So then cultural respect. The Montreal Protocol, 198 countries, lots of cultures in every country, lots of tension over capitalism, communism, blah, blah, blah. You have to still make a deal, and you need all of those people. And so you have to find a way to not run with the flow, not go with the slogans, not decide to be in favor of something today and against it tomorrow, and characterizing a nation as evil or unnecessary or irrelevant or something like that. Tremendous discipline, but easily taught and easily followed out. And then the courage to stay the course. I am appalled at how brave people have to be in 2025 to be a politician. It is extraordinary. So you want to say to yourself, how do you queue up to endure that? Insults and innuendo and physical threats and all the rest. And your ideas are challenged, your attitudes, who you know, what you know, when you knew. So you have to learn how to do that. It was not easy in the Montreal Protocol. If you went back and looked at the ruthless activities of the chemical companies, it was severe. Maybe not as severe as today, but the winners in the game of protecting the ozone layer were durable against all that, and they were courageous. Then you look at the skill sets. You're here at University of Utah, great university, has got a versatile program. You've got a top-rate political science department. You've got these internships and this involvement. So you've got a lot of things going for you. There's a very good platform for strength. So I think that what I would advise, and it was in the title, is you need to be comfortable to do a deep dive into science. And that means that you have to work harder at something you might not have chosen as your profession. But just as the case if you were doing civil rights or food security or something else, you do need to know the details. So when the constituents or the problem solvers or anybody comes in, you can be intelligent and you can find out the truth and you can decide who is exaggerating and who's not, and how do you do this. So the deep dive into science is important. You can take a look on the web. There's lots of excellent science. I'm an economist, a PhD from Berkeley, but I've published in science journals, peer-reviewed science journals, because I know a secret. The secret I know is what science would change the decision. The slogan I use is science too important to leave to chance. Because most of science, people get a grant and they study and they fall across an important finding. That's not good enough when you're in a hurry. But my advantage was I was spending all my time with diplomats and technocrats and the like, and I knew where their questions were and what their reservations were and what the reason was that they were hesitant. And so I could say, well, how do we put together a team of scientists that can answer the question and be influential in changing the minds of those people so that they vote the right way or take the right decision, right? So I found it one of the most powerful of all my skills. I have lots of sorcerer skills, but I think the deep dive into science was terrific. And then the final thing, and this is really hard right now, and I'm working on it, and I'd be glad to report back if I'm successful. In a point in history where science is not as respected as it was, and where there's a lot of attacks against science, you have to obviously become respected again. You have to earn back your respect. It doesn't come from a political vote somewhere in a turnover, pendulum swinging the other way. You really need to build that. So I'm trying to understand, how do you go back? And this is a great question for a political scientist. You should be able to tell the scientists, what do you need to do to get back in the driver's seat? You're not there now. Quit moaning and groaning about no money. Figure out how you're going to get back. You have to restore your point in society and so forth. And you have to be respectable to the targeted audiences. I personally believe that almost everybody in the universe wants a healthy environment and they want their children to have a future and all that stuff. I don't think that's controversy at all. But I think a strong minority of people are out of control, and you have to figure out a way for that audience to sideline them. I'm not advocating they ever become part of the process. I'm not a person that believes stakeholders should be involved. I don't believe that at all. I think they should be irrelevant. I think they should be noise. I think they should be disrespected themselves. People should roll their eyes when people tell these fanciful stories about science as a conspiracy. I mean, it's so ridiculous. It's just, how could it possibly be? We'll never know. So that's the end of my presentation, and I'd be glad to take questions.
All right, so we are going to run the microphone around to you, but why don't we transition to these chairs in the meantime?
Okay.
And we'll have you and Professor Haskins.
I'm going to take this in case I need it.
Absolutely. All right, and Dr. Haskins, did you have anything that you wanted to ask or point out before we kick off to our audience Q&A?
Yeah, I think just to his point, I'll take this quick second to do a little advertisement. If you are interested as a policy student in digging into the science, I teach the class. I teach Intro to Atmospheric Chemistry and Air Pollution. We have an undergraduate version at most 3,100, as well as a graduate special topics version. I have had students who work for the university or for the Utah Department of Air Quality, who are working with governments in Park City to build emissions inventories. I have had civil engineers who want to know how specific proposed traffic actions are going to impact emissions. If you want to learn some of that chemistry in a really accessible way, a little bit of that science, please come take our class. We offer it here at the university. We're a top-ranked Atmos program. With that being said, the other thing that I always get when I talk to students about the Montreal Protocol, which I love because it is such an optimistic story, and I think that resonates now and is more important to recognize than ever. But I've never actually spoken to anyone who worked on the Montreal Protocol who was not an optimist. And I was wondering if you have, if you could share your perspective on sort of the environmental issues that we're trying to tackle today. And your take on those, is this a time for optimism? What can we do? What can we learn? I think I see so many students who think that we can't do anything. And my favorite thing is something you mentioned is the figure that actually shows that the marketing campaign, the messaging was so effective before the Montreal Protocol was passed. The science was put in the hands of the consumers, and the people made a choice. And that choice actually showed up in the data. You can see a reduction in the concentrations of ozone-depleting substances before the policy was passed because people had the information and they made a choice themselves. If we put ourselves on this doom and gloom where we can't do anything to solve climate, we can't do anything to solve persistent environmental toxins, then we take that away from people. And so I'm wondering if you can comment a little bit on that and what sort of perspective we should have in tackling these next sort of major issues.
Yeah, what a great question. How to remain optimistic when there's no reason to be optimistic at all, right? That's the point. So I think the Montreal Protocol has maintained that through intentional activities. So one of them is they call themselves the Start and Strengthen Treaty. And so what they do is they start with a modest plan. So the 1987 Montreal Protocol was a freeze in 3 halons, fire suppression chemicals, and then a 50% reduction in a small cluster of CFCs. And then later they expanded it to cover almost 100 chemicals. But they started out with those things. It was believed that there were hardly a substitute for the solvents. That's why they left it at 50%. They said no one will ever find an alternative to the solvents. And the halons they thought could just be frozen because those are used for fire protection in submarines, aircraft, weapon centers, computer centers, hospitals, lots of places that cannot be evacuated, right? For rare documents where you don't want to damage them with water or foam or powder. things like that. So they started with that, and then quickly there were solutions. U.S. Air Force came forward with some solutions on halon we might come back to. But also the solvent people, January 1988, 4 months after the Montreal Protocol, one of my partnerships announced we had a technology that was spectacular. It was backed by AT&T. So it wasn't some startup company you never heard of with a dream. It was the customer. Because of that, people said, this ship has sailed. We have got to get going. That this false presumption of essentiality. So this enthusiasm for success caused the politicians to be willing to tighten the system. There was no train wreck. There were no unhappy companies. There weren't identified loss of jobs. Nothing bad happened. So the fluorocarbon people have been for years claiming this would be the biggest mistake the world could ever make, would be to care about the environment. And then they care about it for the first time with a binding treaty, and then all of a sudden everything turns out okay. So the optimism becomes contagious. And then if you keep up this momentum, that's really important. And then the second thing that's very important is that we didn't presume answers. We asked the affected industry why they were unable to change. And sometimes it would be an easy answer, like we have never looked at it, we don't know what's happening. So then you'd have to organize research or something. But sometimes it would be, there's a barrier in the way. There's a standard that stops us from doing this. Or they'd have a technology and they'd say, we don't have a standard, that we're not included in the standards, that this fire protection agent doesn't satisfy the safety at sea requirement for ships. And so you cannot use it on a boat, even if it works. That it turns out that you have to change that rule. And so then it shifts the burden to the people that have the power to make a difference. And then if that rule gets changed, a barrier removed or the standard put in place, then people become optimists. How could you be an optimist if you'd spent 5 years developing a replacement and you can't enter the market, right? That would be as depressing as an inventor could possibly find. This is like having windmills and having the permit canceled for the power line to get to the customer, right? It's not that the windmill doesn't work, it's that the permit doesn't work. This is a lot different. So that was a reason for optimism. The third reason, the actual reason I believe, is you don't win if you're not optimistic. I believe in the sports model that you have to believe you're going to win even if you're going to die on the field. That may be the outcome, and it may be that'll happen for 5 years in a row if you're a baseball team. But you have got to believe every time you come out of that dugout that you're going to win or you'll definitely lose. And so I think that you have to do that, and I do believe the Montreal Protocol was hard. I work on climate, and I often argue with the climate guys because they'll say it must have been easy because you were successful. And then they say, well, you say that, let's go one-on-one with what you think your challenges are and our challenges. And we had, I think implanted medical devices, sterilization, metered dose inhalers, and weapon systems are pretty damn difficult. And if you can do those, then certainly you can shift to an electric car. I mean, what are people talking about here? You're all over the streets, for God's sake. And then people say, oh, it's so hard to find a charging station. And then it turns out they buy a car and it's not hard at all. This is a big surprise. Why is that a surprise? Why do you think there's electric cars everywhere? It's because they work. It's a very good market penetration. It's a very good indication. So,
do we have any audience questions here?
Hi, thank you for this great talk. It's wonderful to see you. I'm a professor in the School of Public Affairs. I've been teaching environmental politics for about 20 years now. When I was younger, the Montreal Protocol inspired me actually to go down this road, and I often teach about it as an example of the potential of using treaties to solve huge environmental problems like you've described today. My question to you is, Why, since the Montreal Protocol, have we not really had success when it comes to global treaties around environment? You know, what is the big difference besides the great optimism and, you know, the integrity and some of the other things you suggest? What's missing? Why have we been unsuccessful since that time?
See, this is why you come to a political science class, is to get hard questions. So the question is, why are the lessons of the Montreal Protocol not learned by the other treaties? And I'm one of the people that has pushed hard against those windmills. And we have had some successes in other treaties, and then the Montreal Protocol has actually modified itself to be a climate change treaty because we got tired of telling people that they could do something. We think we'll do it, and then we'll shame them into have to match us. We're competitive. I view it as a creative tension that we would find reductions in hydrofluorocarbon greenhouse gases when they've been under the Kyoto Protocol since 2007 with nothing done, right? So we're already beating them at their own game. They had a chemical they could have gone after, and they ignored it. So then I say to myself, so why didn't you get Kyoto to do it? I was one of the people that got it into the Kyoto Treaty, very controversial. Why should they take up this short-lived climate pollutant? I think it's momentum and reluctance. I think it's siloing. I think that the technical reports should have been separated from the science and the environmental effects. I had a huge war when I worked with the IPCC on a special assessment between the Montreal Protocol. And the war was this: the scientists believed you had to use peer-reviewed literature. And I'm sure there's some reason for that, although I'm starting to doubt it myself. Industry does not have peer-reviewed literature. It does not exist. If you're an inventor and you invent something incredible, it doesn't get published in a peer-reviewed journal. That's not a measure of its merit. It gets published in the market, or it gets published in the endorsement. So it was hell for me to persuade them, which they finally came around, that we could trust industry, that if they said you could do something and they provided the details of how to do it, that's the way it was. So it was a mistake to have the scientists in charge. In the Montreal Protocol, the scientists are in charge of the science. They don't get violated by the technical people, but the technical people aren't throttled back by these arcane rules from the scientists that were made for some academic purpose, right? In University of Utah, if you want to get tenure, you have to score publications, and they have to be peer-reviewed, and they have to be impactful and all the rest of that stuff. Good reason for a scientist. If you're in General Motors and you invent a great battery for an electric car, it does not need peer review. It's a patent, it's a market penetration, it's profit.
I would also, as a scientist, jump in and say that my mentor, Susan Solomon, who you know, she's the lead scientist on the report he's talking about there, she gives a similar lecture, and she says it's the 3 Ps, that it comes down to that the ozone hole was a very personal issue. The risk is very immediate, skin cancer and cataracts, right? That the climate might be warmer in 100 years, that when you know that you have AC, is a much less immediate risk to you. Right? It's a less personal issue to many people. There's many papers, I'm sure, in policy about mitigated risk over risk horizons. The second P being that it was perceptible. It does not take a genius to look at a line graph and see that the ozone goes to 0 over Antarctica in the Antarctic Spring. That does not take a robust scientific skill set to see. So it was an easily communicatable issue. I think it's a lot harder to think about climate feedbacks and forcings, and this offsets that. There's a lot more there that is harder to communicate very clearly without having more robust sort of pieces. And maybe this is what you were talking about a little bit with the science being too muddy here or there. And then the third P being practical. And I think in Susan's version of the talk, she really skates over how much hard work people like you did to actually make those practical alternatives available and force and align industry partners with scientists who maybe did not always see those aligned incentives sort of being there. But yeah, John, did you have a question? Yeah.
John Lynn. I'm a colleague of Jessica's and work a lot on climate issues. And what I've heard, first of all, I'm a big admirer of Montreal Protocol as well. I bring it all the time in my classes. But what I've heard that made it a little easier, maybe a lot easier than the climate problem, is that there are ready solutions like HCFCs that the industry had, and they can make money off of it. So companies like DuPont, one of the main creators of CFCs, had this technology, and that could be adopted quickly. It sounds like that was the case. It took a lot of pushing for them to adopt it, but once they got pushed, then they readily adopt it. The problem with the climate issue is the main emitters, the fossil fuel industry, but they don't have an alternative that they can quickly make money off of. What do you say to that?
Yeah, really good question. So obviously in every controversy like this, you have the chemical producers, that, the suppliers to the product people, tier 1, tier 2, working your way down through components and so forth. So I think that there's some truth to the story that you allude to, that the chemical companies thought they could move to a new set of chemicals. And if they believed that, and that was the reason they supported the Montreal Protocol, that did not turn out to be true. That 85% of the replacement for the ozone depleting chemicals were outside of fluorocarbons. Only 15% were from the companies that made fluorocarbons. So it was a huge turnover. The chemical companies made other things. So they moved on to brominated and chlorinated other things, but they didn't capture the next stage in sustainable technology. So, but I think it was important that I mentioned earlier that for a decade or more, the chemical companies were claiming that there was nothing to the ozone argument, and that a lot of people invested a lot of money and then failed to invest because they thought it was a secure market and they'd be defended, because who could take away medicine from an asthma victim, right? So why would you investigate an alternative? So I think it was instrumental that they realized they had been cheated out of the truth. And then it was also interesting, they decided they had to be in charge of their own fate. I just published a new paper about a technology that's going to be used in all electric vehicles for heat pumps to heat and cool the passengers and batteries and so forth. One of the co-authors was at General Motors, and for the first time he put into this paper documenting how General Motors already had a solution for the air conditioning. So when they got to the Montreal Protocol, they had no worries. They were the only auto company in the world that was relaxed. And so they helped with the Montreal Protocol and the diplomacy and the politics, because they had no fear. So later, everyone had no fear because the technology was there. That it wasn't a company dying because of the Montreal Protocol, it was a company changing for the better. And then often with a much more satisfactory product, lower defects. So we ended up with reducing the defect level for solder joints to almost zero, which is hugely valuable for safety, because the CFC, it turned out, was a wrong turn in technology, that it was an inferior choice.
Do we have any other student questions? I know we're getting kind of close to time here.
Well, hi, thank you. My name is Arden. I'm a political science student here at the U. I've been involved in local government, and I've followed a lot of state and federal government as well, here in Utah especially. So I've seen a lot of the ideas of climate and clean energy being kind of a negative bad word in Utah and also at the national level. So it seems like back then when we approached this kind of conflict, it was kind of a very common sense, practical solution to some of these things. How can we approach some of these issues on national level or federal or state level in a more approachable and more not super bad word way, where it's not like as evil of a thing sometimes?
Another tough guy. So it turns out that the world today is not the world there always was. So in 1988, when the Montreal Protocol, excuse me, came up for ratification, it was a 100% vote. Everyone voted for ratification. So that's an incredible measure of how satisfied 1 year after signing everyone is. The states, the locals, the federal, the companies, everybody thought this was a well-crafted treaty that was fair and right. And then as time went on, a little controversial, but it was signed by Reagan and it went on to a million other politicians. I never noticed the change in politics until recently, that there was always support for the Montreal Protocol. And I was saying last night at dinner, even now, the affected industry is writing to the White House and telling them, keep your hands off the Montreal Protocol. This is a treaty that's pro-business and pro-environment because it saved our asses and save us again. And it shows us where to go, gives us investment certainty. It keeps us on the right track. It's made it, they know that they made their products better and that they're doing things they could never have done with the old products. So it's, I think it takes a rewind, and it also takes a lot of energy, as you're suggesting, to go back and remind people of the aspects of the Montreal Protocol to them. How did it make your life better? How did it make your company better? I also am very proud that the engineers that did these technical breakthroughs consider the Montreal Protocol as the best part of their life, because they were working on something important. We broke down the barriers of corporate boundaries, so they got to work in cross-corporate teams, cross-international teams, and so they got to be with the giants that they never would have been able to work with. So you get 10 geniuses together from 7 countries. This is like a candy store, because they've been sequestered in some dungeon in a company and told they can't mention to their families or friends anything they're doing. A non-disclosure agreement with a heavy penalty, right? They can't even change jobs. And so all of a sudden, they're liberated, literally, to be as good as they can be. And then they compete so severely because they want to show that their company and they are as good as anybody else. So people are working nights and weekends and spending their own budgets, and it was just exactly what you want. Fever. It's like dance fever.
I heard you mention at dinner last night a little bit in regards to the fact that sometimes when you approach something that seemed kind of irretractable, it seems like you were able to bring in leadership to sort of point out and frame the issue in a different way, where perhaps it wasn't all about butting heads and it's clean energy against jobs. I think that juxtaposition actually gets pushed against one another very often. And I think what Dr. Anderson had mentioned to me was sort of in his leadership style, it often came about how to frame the issue differently. Instead of just saying there's this hard juxtaposition we can't get past, can we frame engaging and developing renewable energy as an economic opportunity, as a way to get jobs, as a way to become a national leader? Can you create an award that might add that to someone's political CV, some resume there? I think in this time, especially, I've been thinking about a lot of ways to reframe my own research and see where, just because this is my intention of wanting to, push XYZ policy or see XYZ environmental regulation happen, perhaps approaching the issue with other involved parties in a different way and thinking more and engaging authentically with their interests might be a way to take some ground where we have not found any. Sort of using a stick. I think I said last night, you turned your stick into a carrot, is what I was observing through some of the stuff you were talking about.
Yeah, so a practical piece of advice would be that the Utah Clean Energy Center needs politics right now. That they're doing exactly that they've been providing jobs and wealth and clean air and more reliable systems and so forth to Utah, but they have headwinds right now. So you could actually be a great place to say, how can an organization that's found itself in harm's way get themselves out of that and re-persuade people? I think all my life I've thought that one of the advantages of the Montreal Protocol is that the citizens did not have to be involved after 1987, that we did our jobs inside the thing. A good government doesn't need citizens. It provides what the citizens ask for without asking again, and without complaining, and without getting involved in the details. That being left alone in your office, if you're a federal worker, is a joy. But it, it's a it's a very, very interesting. To give you another contemporary problem, right now I'm working with Ghana and Africa on energy efficiency because they don't have a lot of access to energy efficiency products. And in fact, we have this campaign that's changing that around a little bit. But one of the things we realized when we talked to the Ghana Energy Commission and the local enterprises and so forth, when we're doing our reconnaissance to find out what do you need to change this, rather than presuming we would have the answer and come in with a minimum energy efficiency standard or something. One of the things that they impressed upon us in Ghana and Morocco both was that the money saved on electricity for energy efficiency is spent locally on nutrition, healthcare, education, and it circulates in the local economy. Everything spent on energy is imported technology, imported energy to those countries. They are not self-sufficient. So it turns out that the average household that buys the highest efficiency air conditioner can pay for a kid to go to college with the savings from the air conditioner. So that changes that family's life forever. It's a huge impact. And so they've started to sell that from the Energy Commission. They're running ads, they're running workshops, they're meeting with citizens, they're meeting with the banks. Bank of Africa is on board, that they understand that if you're interested in community development, as most banks claim to be, then you would have to loan people money for the better product. Otherwise, they're forever stuck in poverty. In Ghana, they call it importing poverty. They buy the machine, and then it turns up their money for the rest of their lives, right? And in places like China, air conditioning is essential, because if you don't have air conditioning and you're in crowded housing, then you don't get sleep. And if you don't get sleep, you get fired from your factory, because you cannot be lazy at a factory and you cannot be dangerous at a factory. So air conditioning is more important than food in some places. So making it efficient so you can crawl out from that miserable situation and get up on education and work your way out of menial labor is incredibly important. So I think we're going to, here I'm optimistic again, I think we're going to do this because it's the right thing to do, and because it's right because it pays off for the people and the health and the environment. And people like me care about humans a lot, but oddly enough, I like to tune up my optimism with nature and scenery and things like that. Turns out I have an affection for Earth that is motivating. And so one of the things people, when they try to say, Steve, how can we get you to work? Then I tell them, well, I'd like you to work on more than protecting the climate, and I'd like you to do some ocean work. Because a lot of these diplomats are diplomats for all these topics. Sometimes that works. But I tell them, you can't just do half your job on climate and ozone. You've got to do the climate, the species and the oceans and all the rest of that stuff. So I think you can drive optimism. I think it works. I think the technical problems are resolvable. And I think these detractors will become irrelevant if you guys do your job.
Yeah. And I guess with that, let's give Dr. Anderson a big round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys for coming to today's forum, and yeah, feel free to hang out and yeah, have a great rest of your day.